We got the rest of the time for our program here, which is on the nuclear arms race and all its different manifestations of the race itself, which has very deleterious effects on the social determinant of health. Most obviously, all the money that goes to the arms race that could be used for all sorts of other social issues, including health care. Washington's positions for social responsibility is a long-standing organization which I've been a member of since the late 70s or early 80s when I was in New York. I've been to two of their events recently, and they had a whole lot of people turn out. And the one, there was a smaller one, and then the one at the UW a few weeks ago was really outstanding. And I think Lilly is the main person putting that together and organizing it. So I was astounded by some of the facts that came to light there about, like, one nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan could change the Earth's temperature by 10 degrees because of all the nuclear cloud and stuff. Anybody here conceive of that? Because we talk about climate change is, 2 or 3 degrees in 50 years or something, but here's something with a nuclear exchange, and just a limited one involving two countries with, 1/100th of the nuclear bombs that are out there.
But I think that nuclear winter actually cools the climate, so maybe that's the solution to global warming.
So there's an organization Lilly will talk about that we have an opportunity as PNHP Western Washington to sign on to that coalition. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us today. I'm going to let Joe kick it off. As Joe said, he's a member of our Nuclear Abolition Task Force, which is a group of volunteers and members who work with us.
Closer to your mouth.
Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So the task force helps set our strategic plan and carry it out, and Joe's one of those members. So he's going to talk a little bit about kind of the health perspective and why he, as a health professional, is involved in this work. And then I will share a little bit more about some of the current issues we're working on and what exactly our coalition is and what it means to join. It's fine.
My name is Joe Berkson, and I recently retired last year, a year ago, and in my retirement I've been working with this task force, and it's been really great work for me, and I'm here to advocate for physicians for a national health program joining our coalition, and Lilly will talk more about that a little later. I came from being a family practice physician for over 4 decades. I worked at Group Health for my career, and then Kaiser when they bought us. And that was a good experience for me. I was into preventive medicine. That's why I went there. I think both the preventive medicine as well as the politics of medicine are sort of in my training. When I got to the University of Illinois, I was a little alienated coming out of the 60s at Oberlin College, power to the people and all that. And the head of community medicine at University of Illinois was Quentin Young. So my first 4 years, all 4 years in medical school, I went to the urban preceptorship, which was a series of visitors from around the country talking about the politics of healthcare. So, and as you know, Quentin's, very left liberal guy. And I first heard about group health at the first year in that urban preceptorship seminar. So it really affected my life a lot. So that, in addition, in high school, right before college, I was debating the topic in a formal debate club, resolved that, there should be a verifiable test ban treaty internationally. And so I was reading the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and, reading about the issue. And so both of these are kind of in my early years and have followed it up until the present time, hearing Daniel Ellsberg come through town and reading the Doomsday Machine. And anyway, it's clear to me as a physician that nuclear weapons are a public health issue. Some of you have talked about that already, at every stage. So the mining, the production, the obviously use or accidental use, and the disposal, which we haven't figured out yet, of these weapons and the material all affect human health. And it's pretty much a disaster. As we were talking about nuclear winter, it could be an existential issue for, human beings on the Earth, because a big nuclear exchange, which I'd have to check the notes from that lecture, but I think the big nuclear exchange takes it down 10 degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit. A limited nuclear exchange takes it down 5 degrees centigrade on the average. But that would be similar to the last ice age, the average temperatures in the last ice age. And because of the soot in the highest levels of the atmosphere, the theory is, and it's not been tested, thank God, that there would be enough shielding of the sunlight that it would basically fail all agriculture for about 10 years. So I'm sure we would have to get very clever, but there's no way that most of us would survive that. So it's an existential issue, it's an ethical issue. So there are a lot of ways to argue against nuclear weapons, and that's why I'm happy to be working on it. So what I'm advocating is that this organization, Physicians for National Health Plan, which I'm in as on the national level, I haven't come here, but I've been a member for probably whatever, it's been around 20 or 30 years. So Lily's going to tell you more about the coalition and why this organization should consider joining the coalition. So.
Great, thank you. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about kind of the issues that we're facing right now when it comes to nuclear weapons, just to kind of give a little context for why we even formed this coalition in the first place. So right now the US has roughly 6,500 nuclear weapons. The limited exchange that Joe and David were talking about that would, drop the Earth's temperature 5 degrees and put us in an ice age would involve 100 nuclear weapons, and we have 6,500. So we have more than enough to end the world many times over. And we're planning to spend $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years maintaining and rebuilding that entire arsenal. And I think, $1 trillion is a pretty giant number that's hard to imagine. So I'd like to break it down. It comes out to $4.6 million every single hour that passes. So over the course of this meeting, $5 million spent on nuclear weapons every hour for the next 30 years. So I think we all could think about many different things that we would rather spend $1.2 trillion on. Also, just I think since Joe is passing out the different forms, it says 1.7 trillion on one of the forms you're seeing, and that's with inflation, but it's $1.2 trillion in today's dollars. So, this obviously takes away from the programs that we know we so desperately need for our communities, whether that is healthcare, or education, or infrastructure, or work on climate change. There are endless issues that we could spend this money on. But I think this is kind of a value statement from our government that they are ready to spend this kind of money on the deadliest weapons ever made that we can only hope will never be used, that could end all life on the planet, over those other kinds of investments that would truly help our communities. And so this is one aspect of, the injustice of nuclear weapons, but especially in this administration, we're seeing some extremely dangerous policies that are increasing the risk of nuclear catastrophe at a really alarming rate, and are putting our, entire all life on Earth at risk. So One of those is that this Trump administration is on a plan to build entirely new nuclear weapons that are more usable. I think most of us would prefer to not have more usable nuclear weapons in the hands of this president especially. But these new nuclear weapons, and coupled with the spending on nuclear weapons, is really driving a new global nuclear arms race. And we're seeing that already with Russia and China, who are also upgrading their own arsenals. We're also pulling out of really fundamental nuclear treaties that have limited nuclear weapons in the past and continue to do so today, and have greatly reduced the risk of nuclear warfare or some sort of accident with nuclear weapons. So the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, has been in the news a lot lately. The Trump administration has announced its plan to withdraw from that, pulling out of the Iran deal. These kinds of actions are extremely destabilizing and dangerous. And then we have that coupled with the kind of rhetoric that we saw from Trump earlier this year with North Korea, kind of two extremely unstable leaders goading each other, throwing threats back and forth across Twitter. These kinds of policies are extremely dangerous and are truly risking nuclear war. And so this is kind of the context in which we have really ramped up our efforts on this issue. I think also it's important to remember that for us here in Washington State, and especially in Seattle, this is a very local issue. So Washington State is home to the largest collection of ready-to-use nuclear weapons in the entire country, at the Kitsap Bangor Naval Base, just 20 miles from where we're all sitting right now. So if Washington State were its own country, it would actually be the third largest nuclear weapons nation in the world. And that really makes Washington, and especially Seattle here so close to those nuclear weapons, a target. So this is a very personal and local issue for us here. So this is a very scary situation, and we have to think about what can we do about it, and that's why we formed this coalition called Washington Against Nuclear Weapons. So this was formed about 2 years ago. Our main goal is to influence national policy to enact better, safer nuclear policy. And we formed the coalition because, WPSR has been working on this issue since the 80s, and PSR has been working on it since the 50s. But we know that we are so much stronger and so much more powerful when we work together. And I'm sure that you guys were, working with Physicians for a National Health Plan, understand the concept that a movement, that many groups, many individuals all working towards a common cause are much more powerful than one group working alone. So we really formed the coalition to build the local movement around this issue. We started with kind of your traditional peace groups, and then I think really one of the strengths of our coalition is that we have expanded beyond that to include really diverse organizations. So we now include educators and labor groups and social justice organizations and environmental groups and health organizations. And that really shows a kind of breadth of commitment to the issue, beyond just peace organizations. That is really important and powerful when we're talking to others. There are a lot of different people who care very deeply about this issue and want to see change. And the other kind of strength that we have, I think, as a group, or one of our other strengths, is that we now have 40 organizations, which is wonderful, but they're also not just in Seattle. This is truly a statewide movement. We're all across the state. We have groups in Spokane and Olympia and Bellingham and the Olympic Peninsula, so we're all over. We work on three main things. The first is just raising awareness and educating people about the issue of nuclear weapons and why they should care and why they should get involved. So we do things like panels and events like the one that David went to, or movie screenings, local groups, presentations, sending out information in different groups as newsletters, educational work like that. We also do direct lobbying, so we meet directly with our members of Congress. Actually, WPSR and our coalition makes it our goal to meet with every member of Congress every year, or their staff at least once, but we've held 50 meetings over the past 2 years with members of Congress or their staff. And we bring our coalition members with us. So this is showing them that their constituents and their voters care about this issue, and that is really the strength of having this coalition, is to go to these meetings with all these various groups and their representatives. And then we couple that direct lobbying with grassroots efforts to pressure members of Congress. So things like, phone calls and emails and letters into their offices, and local resolutions that, call them out, and media pieces directed at members of Congress, and all of that sort of stuff that shows that beyond just those one-on-one meetings, that, their constituents much more broadly care about this issue. We are working right now actually on a state resolution, so we'll be introducing very soon, we'll be pre-filing a resolution with the Washington State Legislature to show Washington's opposition to these extremely dangerous nuclear policies and the spending that we're seeing. And then we're also working on some exciting policies that have come forth over the last year that are going to be reintroduced in 2019. One is a no first use policy. So currently the United States still retains the right to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, or even unprovoked. We have not ever said that we will not use nuclear weapons first, and we think that is extremely dangerous and increases the risk of conflict. So Representative Adam Smith has introduced a bill, and will reintroduce it to create a no first use policy. And then this, as I said, this administration is creating new nuclear weapons, or has plans to do so, and another thing we'll be working on next year is working to cancel a quote-unquote low-yield nuclear weapon, roughly the same size as those used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so low yield is quite the misnomer, but that are seen as much more usable by the military and by those in power. So we'll be working on that as well in the coming year. So I want to talk a little bit too about what it means to join the coalition, and I'm happy to answer more questions as well. But we have kind of two different ways that groups can join, and you'll see that on the back of those half sheets. You'll see coalition members and then supporting organizations. So we have active members of the coalition, and that entails generally having a representative from your organization who either joins our monthly meetings, either in person or remotely. We have options to call in, or is in contact with WPSR. So a lot of coalition members can't make the monthly meetings, but they're in contact with me or others in the task force, or they stay in touch, so some sort of representative. And then the active members also engage in our educational and advocacy efforts in a way that works for them. So this looks different pretty much for every coalition member. Some work on events with us, some put on their own events, some do things like send out information to their members or send out action alerts to their members. Some are engaged at every single meeting, and some come to a meeting once a year, but it all kind of depends on each group. But they kind of, as an active member, the really key part is that you have the representative and are committed to doing some sort of engagement with our coalition work throughout the year, whatever that looks like for you. The second way to join the coalition is as a supporting organization, which means that you're essentially lending your name in support of our group. You're listed on our materials. It's a signal that you endorse our vision and our mission and our goals, but you're not actively involved, so you don't have a representative and aren't necessarily engaging in the work the coalition carries out, although of course some of them do in some ways every now and then, but for groups that aren't able to have that kind of active engagement. And yeah, I think that another real benefit of the coalition is that, we now have this group of 40 different organizations, and we really encourage coalition members to share what they're working on with the coalition. So, I send out a weekly email to a whole, all of the groups, and we have upcoming events that you can share, or announcements or action items that you would like to share. We do that frequently for our coalition members, and it's this whole network that you can now, be a part of. But I also think that, the issues that both of our groups work on are very large issues with big goals, and they're hard to work on, and they take a lot of time and effort. I do think just one of the best things about the coalition is this wonderful community that has formed around, what can be a very tough issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear war, but it's a very inspiring group of activists working towards making the world a better place, and that's, I think one of the best things about joining is to be a part of that wonderful group. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have or just let you discuss amongst yourselves, but thank you again so much for having us, and thank you for your interest in this very important issue.
Two questions. Where do your monthly meetings occur?
What?
Where do your monthly meetings occur?
So we hold our meetings at El Centro de la Raza, which is in Beacon Hill, but then we also have a conference call number that groups can call into.
And does PSR have any position on nuclear energy vis-a-vis a carbon-free energy policy?
We don't have a nuclear energy program, and as I don't work specifically on nuclear energy, PSR National, is not in support of nuclear energy because of the waste and because of the connection to the creation of nuclear weapons. But in our coalition, we do not engage on nuclear energy issues at all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You work with or for certain people at the Congress and at the Senate nationally?
What?
So the question is, do you work with or for people in Congress?
Oh.
So we do not endorse any candidates. We're a 501c3. The coalition is not actually registered as its own nonprofit, but WPSR is a 501c3. So we lobby our members of Congress, but we have different opinions than almost every one of our members of Congress in Washington State on various issues. And we are constantly pushing every one of them to do better on this issue, but we don't we don't endorse, or we are not the mouthpiece for any of them either. Yeah.
Beyond lobbying, do you organize any direct actions?
So beyond lobbying, do you organize any direct actions? Yeah, we do both. Some of our coalition members are more engaged in direct action. So like the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, for example, some of you may be aware of, is a group that almost entirely engages in protests around the naval base that houses nuclear weapons, and we support those kinds of efforts. We also do carry out, direct actions as a coalition, but it kind of varies from year to year what kinds of direct actions we do, but we do both. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you have any statistical information for the negative impact on the state of Washington financially.
Oh.
And also in terms of health disparities. I know that they were talking about a few years ago, I guess with the implementation of the ACA, Dorothy Teeter was challenged with determining negative health impacts by industry or location or various aspects around the state. And I'm really thinking about Hanford, as well as possibly Bangor as well. And so I'm wondering if you have any statistical information about that, because we're pretty much healthcare providers and caregivers, and so that's the kind of information that would really help us to
understand you.
Yeah. So the question is, let me make sure that I actually understand your question correctly. What is the statistical information around the economic impact of nuclear weapons in Washington State, and then the health impacts as well. So as you said that, I was just thinking I want to look this up on my phone, because we work with one of our other chapters, PSRLA. They calculate every year the tax burden for each state, because our tax dollars go towards supporting nuclear weapons. And I want to say that it's $4.6 million last year of Washington taxpayer money, but the problem is it might have been 4.6 billion, and that's a very big difference. So I can look that up if you give me a moment to get you the correct answer there, because I don't want to give you misinformation. we look at a number of different health effects from the nuclear weapons industry in Washington state. Hanford, of course, is the most well-known, which was the site where the U.S. actually produced the majority of the plutonium that was made for the U.S.'s nuclear weapons during the Cold War. But there is also a uranium mine in Washington state called the Midnight Mine. This is on the land of the Spokane tribe of Indians on their reservation in eastern Washington. That has had very significant health impacts on the community there. And then we also have a very large Marshallese population in Washington, one of the largest in the country. The Marshall Islands was the site of 67 nuclear tests during the Cold War in the atmosphere, and that had major effects on the population in terms of health. I would have to refer you to some of our other experts on the health effects of Hanford. For the Spokane, for the Spokane tribe and the uranium mine there, one of the challenges of this issue is that there has not been a comprehensive study of, cancer rates, for example, from that effect. The cleanup of the Midnight Mine, in fact, only started last year, and it was shut down 36 years ago. It's now listed as a Superfund site, but I don't have any exact information. I did just dig into some of the studies that the EPA has done when they classified it as a Superfund site, and I'd be happy to send that your way. And it has some very damning information about the health effects. They basically said that in some areas, the possibility of getting cancer was almost 100% from the activities there. But I would have much more specifics in the report, but I don't have the figures off the top of my head.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
are some of those things going to be, okay, I'm thinking of Hanford right now,
Right.
because I know a lot of people are getting sick at Hanford just
Yes.
working there. And so are those federal liabilities, or are those state liabilities, and are we being held accountable for things that are being forced on us by the state, by the federal government?
So there is RECA, which is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is a federal law or federal compensation program that deals with sites that were related to nuclear weapons activities more generally. There is also, though, I know that just last legislative session, there was a law passed in the Washington state legislature around compensating workers from Hanford that actually increased their ability to get coverage and put the burden of information on Hanford, not on the workers. So kind of assuming more that if people got sick from working there, that it was because of Hanford.
Is that only for Hanford, or is that also for the other?
That's just for Hanford, yeah. So the Spokane, or the Midnight Mine on the land of the Spokane tribe of Indians is not covered by RECA, by the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And there was also a law passed around getting some compensation there that was at the state, but implementation has been extremely spotty. I think when I last talked to people, they said something like 3 or 4 people had received compensation. So they're basically, to answer your question more broadly, there are both federal and state actors at work in covering the health consequences from those, yeah.
What's the status of Hanford being a nuclear waste dump for the rest of the country? I hear about that from time to time. Is that been going on at a low level, or is it just something that other states or nuclear sites want to get rid of their stuff and it's going to end up in Hanford?
Yeah, I think I'm struggling to remember the details, but I know Idaho just made a decision around this, I think that waste was going to be moved from Hanford to Idaho, and they said, no, we're not taking it. So that fight continues to go on. I mean, there are many problems with dealing with the waste. I know a big problem right now is the reclassification of waste at Hanford. There's a bunch of high-level radioactive waste that the Department of Energy is working to reclassify as low or non-high-level radioactive waste, which means they wouldn't have to treat it. So that's a major problem, but there's kind of this constant question of, is the best thing to keep it at Hanford or to move it somewhere else, and that is continually disputed and not resolved, and yeah, I don't have, I guess, a definitive answer for you there. It continues to be debated. Yeah.
I have a question along a different line, kind of.
Yeah.
What, how much does our overly large collection of nuclear weapons act as a deterrent against other countries beefing up theirs? And a corollary to that is if there's any truth to the idea that our stockpile is getting old and needs to be repaired or regenerated or rebuilt or something, does that make sense? And so if we said, oh, well, we'll just let it deteriorate so it's of no use, what effect does that have on relationships with Russia and China, for example?
Sure. Okay, so I think two main questions there. One, what is the value of having these nuclear weapons in Washington State as a deterrent for other countries? And, I guess kind of more generally, do our nuclear weapons serve as a deterrent for nuclear conflict? And second, sorry, I'm blanking. Oh, do we need to, maintain and make sure that they are safe, and are they going are they getting old, and do we need to replace them? Okay, so I will tackle the first question. Is this is a kind of ongoing debate around the theory of nuclear deterrence more generally, and this is something that we could do a whole day conference on and really get into. But this is the general theory of why we have nuclear weapons in the first place, that if you have nuclear weapons and the other country has nuclear weapons, neither of you will use them because you know that if you use them, you'll be retaliated, they will retaliate, and everyone will die, and that's mutually assured destruction. This is, the theory of deterrence is truly a theory, we can also look at our nuclear weapons as actually an instigator for other countries to get nuclear weapons and to start conflicts. So we see this with North Korea. The US having nuclear weapons shows that they have value and that they give us status and power. That's what we're saying when we say that we must have them, and that makes other countries want to have that status and power by having nuclear weapons. The same thing with Iran. We would much rather see the US taking the lead and saying, yes, we all have these nuclear weapons, but, we are at this kind of continual standoff, but we can decrease our stockpiles and still have that same kind of security that we feel nuclear weapons provide us, with far, far fewer nuclear weapons, and then work eventually to eliminate them. And I think whether or not you believe in deterrence as an effective way to avoid conflict, I think that is something that is much more common sense, that yes, we have these weapons, but we should be reducing them. We have no need for 6,500 when 100 weapons alone could destroy the earth. That's a very short answer to a much larger question, but do you want to?
Yeah, I want to weigh in on one thing. I recently heard that one of the main proponents of this for years, one of the main proponents of this mutually assured destruction deterrence for years, Henry Kissinger, changed his mind. Because and he's no longer for advocating for that, he's advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and we moved toward that, which sort of shocked me. But his rationale was that the mutually assured destruction, kind of worked with very few nuclear actors, but now when there were, Europe and us and the Soviet Union and China, that was it. There were very few. That now there's many more, including Pakistan, India,
North Korea.
Iran, or Iraq, no, Israel probably. Anyway, there's and North Korea, and not all of these have the most stable leaders. Things could get out of hand.
We don't have
very easily. So not our, of course, but that's why that falls apart, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing about the theory of deterrence is that it works until the time that it doesn't work. And, you know, if someone does decide to use nuclear weapons, whether that is because they are unstable or they had a bad morning or there was misinformation that there was a nuclear attack heading their way, or if it was just an accident. There have been thousands of accidents involving nuclear weapons over the years. Those are only the ones that we know about. And so if nuclear weapons were ever to be used for any reason, the theory of deterrence completely falls apart. So the second question is, are nuclear weapons safe? Do they need to be upgraded? So the way that the plutonium pits that we currently have that are intercurrent nuclear weapons were designed to last many more decades than where we are now. They will be functional for much longer. And so we don't need to replace those warheads themselves. And yes, we should make sure that they are safe. So, you know, we have aging systems and we are now prone to cyber attacks, things that, you know, weren't a problem when we first created these nuclear weapons. We should make sure that we know where our nuclear weapons are. There have been situations where nuclear weapons have simply been lost or unguarded. We should make sure that all of those things are taken care of and that the material is safe, but that does not take $1.2 trillion. The reason that the spending on nuclear weapons is so high is because we're not just talking about maintaining, we're talking about completely rebuilding every single part of our arsenal. Our nuclear submarines, our ground-based missiles, our intercontinental ballistic missiles, and our bombers and our air-launched missiles. And when we're rebuilding them, we are working to make them deadlier and more dangerous and stealthy, and essentially we're starting to make them look more like war-fighting weapons than this, you know, idea of them as a deterrent. So we're not just, you know, rebuilding them to make sure they're safe. We're rebuilding them to make them more usable and deadlier, and that's really dangerous. And that, you know, that's the kind of money that we don't need to spend on nuclear weapons.
How did that decision get made? I forget, was it Obama?
How did the decision get made to rebuild our entire arsenal? Yeah, so this actually started under the Obama administration. You may be familiar with the New START Treaty. This was signed under Obama with Russia. It requires both countries to limit their nuclear weapons to, I think, 1,550 missiles and 800 warheads, I think. And in exchange, in order to get the treaty passed, they basically included a provision saying that both countries could, quote unquote, modernize their arsenals, which has meant that they could rebuild them entirely. And that kicked off this spending spree by both the US and Russia to, quote unquote, modernize their entire arsenals and rebuild them. Yes.
One question. My wife grew up in Richland, Washington, which is right near Hanford, so she goes in periodically for testing to see whether she's still radioactive. No, I'm just kidding. My real question is, our two senators, Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell, and my representative, Jayapal, have they expressed their feeling about whether we should avoid nuclear energy for electrical use or anything like that? Have they said that we should not be using that, or have they been non-committal?
Okay, this is actually really beyond what I know about their positions, because I actually don't work on nuclear energy almost at all. I think that Senator Cantwell is in support of nuclear energy and in support of small modular nuclear reactors. Murray, I don't know.
I think, were you talking about weapons or nuclear
No,
energy?
For energy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I should know, but I actually don't ever work on nuclear energy policy, so, or talk to them about it. So, sorry to not be able to answer your question.
I wonder if you include in your outreach some of these stories that I've heard about near misses like that fellow in Russia who thought that they may be under attack, but decided to, didn't want to do anything rash, check, double check, and it turned out, oh no, it wasn't an attack. Well, he apparently took early retirement and died of alcoholism after having gone through that.
Yeah, so this is part of those thousands of accidents and near misses. I mean, there are dozens of near misses where the US or Russia has come within minutes of launching nuclear weapons at each other, and where they have felt that there were imminent attacks on their country already, and that was due to the sun radiating off of a cloud in the wrong way and confusing their sensors, or in one case a flock of birds that flew in front of their satellites and that confused them, or technical problems. At one point, the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear weapons on North Carolina on accident, and one of them, there are 6 safety switches and 5 of them failed, and the last one didn't, and it nearly blew up the entire state of North Carolina. Who dropped it? We've dropped it. Yeah, we were flying them from one place to another, and the plane crashed, and we dropped the weapons. So, things like that have happened throughout the history of nuclear weapons. Many people say that we have not used nuclear weapons since 1945 due to luck, not due to the design of our command and control systems or because of our policies, but due to pure luck, and one day our luck will run out.
The storage of nuclear material, are we doing any research about it? Do we know? I'd like to see 1.2 trillion put on that.
Yes, well, it would be much better if we were much more of that money were going to solving this problem of what do we do with the waste.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, at Hanford right now, the plan is to turn the waste into glass. That's vitrification, and that's glass is easier to handle and store than the liquid form that the waste is in now. That plan has been in place for a very long time. They've been working to set up the systems and the facilities and infrastructure needed to do that, but it keeps getting delayed and costs are overrun, and the process still hasn't started. So that was one idea, and they're still pursuing that. But I mean, I think we still truly don't know what to do with the waste. There's no clear solution as of right now.
I think we live in a nation of denial, and Ellen DeGeneres has that goofy game show, and 2 of the contestants introduced themselves as nuclear missilers, and they are goofy dumping into hot chocolate and everything. So I'm just wondering, as you break denial with the lawmakers, Washington state lawmakers, because they're also in denial, have you had any success with them bringing that information to their constituents, the physical, mental, economic costs? Do you follow my question?
So have we had any success?
So when you talk to the lawmakers,
So have we had any success?
Yeah, can you hear?
Yeah. So I think the question is, when we talk to our lawmakers, our members of Congress, do we have any success convincing them? Is that right, that they need to do more on this issue? The answer is yes. I think one of the really exciting parts of seeing this coalition grow over the last 2 years and working with it is that we have seen a lot of success with our members of Congress, and they have moved actually quite a bit on this issue. So we have, we do a lot of numerical goals in our organization, but 8 of our 12 members of Congress, including both of our senators and 6 House representatives, have made at least one really positive, strong public statement in line with our policy priorities on nuclear weapons in just this past year. And I want to share a few examples because they are really exciting. So Senator Cantwell, for example, had been fairly silent on this issue. She'd done a few things kind of here and there. We worked with her staff quite a bit. And she actually ended up in 2017 she introduced 4 of her own amendments to a budget bill specifically around non-proliferation issues on really excellent nuclear policies. And that came about because we had a constituent say something at a town hall meeting, and that in conjunction with us meeting with her staff, she asked her staff to come up with policies that they could work on around nuclear weapons issues. And she's since bragged about that kind of work to other people. We had a member of Congress, Denny Heck, who represents Olympia. We talked to him a couple of years ago about this issue, and he said, you know, nuclear weapons is just not something I work on. It's not in my committee. I don't, you know, it's not something I'm going to really do anything on. We since, you know, met with him many times and his staff and brought constituents and had constituents contact him. And we had this wonderful meeting with a bunch of his constituents and asked him to co-sponsor a bill called the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act, and a few weeks later he co-sponsored that bill. And now we meet with him really regularly, and he's really on board on a lot of these issues, and is much more open to talking about this kind of policy. I mean, I could really go on, but, you know, for each one of those 8 members of Congress, we've actually really seen significant movement. And, you know, nuclear weapons policy is tough. It takes a really long time, but to change that policy. But what we're seeing in Washington is that now a majority of our members of Congress are actually in line with our policy priorities, which is, or with at least some of our policy priorities, and that's really exciting.
And stay tuned, because Adam Smith is going to be the, probably going to be the head of the Armed Services Committee in the new House. So, and he's very strong in trying to craft reductions of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any active refining of plutonium going on in Washington State or anywhere in the country now?
Making new plutonium.
New plutonium and, you know, refining it down to...
Yeah, so Hanford is now entirely around waste, so they're not making any new plutonium. We are making new plutonium pits for nuclear weapons. So the plutonium pit is the core of a nuclear warhead that actually has the nuclear reaction and is what causes the nuclear explosion. We are making new ones, and there was actually a law that was just passed last year to increase the production of plutonium pits up to 80 pits per year.
Where is that being made?
So those are being made at the Savannah River site in Georgia, and at, no, they're stored at Pantex in Texas,
Nevada?
Kansas City, I think. Kansas City, I believe, is the other place in Missouri where they're being made, but I'm forgetting the name of the site right now. But they're being made with plutonium that already exists. So that is at least my understanding. Yeah, but this increase in the production of plutonium pits is for it's part of this rebuilding of our entire arsenal. They're meant to be made for a new type of nuclear weapon that has been proposed that doesn't exist yet itself, and that is also much more destabilizing.
Would those bombs be assembled in Savannah, or would the pits be flown to our local nuclear subbase and assembled there, or what?
Oh, you're really testing my knowledge here of the way that a nuclear weapon is created. I believe that they would probably the pits themselves would be made at the Savannah River site, but then other parts of the nuclear weapon are made at other sites, and they would be assembled separately.
Where could we do some direct action?
Yes, so there's a group called the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability that is a whole network of organizations all across the country, especially those who work at, or protest these specific nuclear sites. And they're all engaged in, direct actions around their specific sites that, they work with. So I would be definitely happy to connect you with the groups that are planning those direct actions in those specific locations. And then here in Washington, like I said, the biggest group doing that is the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action. Well, and our coalition is really specifically Washington focused, but we do I mean, I do especially connect with these other groups at a more national level. Our coalition specifically probably wouldn't be engaged in the protests in other states or direct actions in other states, but I would absolutely support them and yeah, could connect you, absolutely.
Yeah, where is the public in general, not just Washington, but the public in general on the issue of nuclear weapons these days?
That's a big question. It depends on exactly what issue you're talking about. I mean, I would say in a very general sense, the public is just not that aware of nuclear weapons issues in the way that they were during the Cold War when it was a much more, or felt like a much more urgent and imminent threat. And especially for folks in my generation who were born after the Cold War ended, it's not on our radars. It wouldn't be in most people's kind of top 10 issues that they care about or are thinking about. I think that changes a little bit when something like the, escalation with North Korea happens, or, something like, Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, then there's some, kind of public awareness that goes up. But in general, it's off most people's radars. More specifically, I can say that there's been a lot of survey data that's come out recently from some specific nuclear weapons groups around where they stand on specific issues like the first use of nuclear weapons, or should the president have sole authority to launch our nuclear weapons, which is the current policy. The president alone can launch our nuclear weapons without consulting anyone else in the government or the military. And a majority of the public does not support that idea of, sole authority, and a majority of the public does not support the U.S. using nuclear weapons first in a conflict. And I could get some more exact polling numbers for you if you're interested. But I think that I don't have any sort of exact number on this, but I would say that there are still many people, I would probably, I don't want to give you like a false numbers because I don't have an exact number like right on the top of my head, but there's still a lot of support for having nuclear weapons in the first place for various reasons, whether that's because you see them, people feel that they keep us safer, or they feel that it's just impossible to get rid of nuclear weapons, or so a lot of people still feel that we should have them for whatever reason.
What about upgrading the system like Obama proposed and Trump is carrying on? Are people supportive of that? Even they know it's going to take billions of dollars to do it.
People are not supportive when you talk to them about the money that it will cost, especially when you talk about what it takes away from other programs. The crafty thing about saying nuclear weapons modernization is that modernization sounds really nice. And people like modern things, and so it's a very great way for that side to frame it. So I think if you just said, do you support the modernization of nuclear weapons, a lot of people would say yes. If you go more into the details of what that means in terms of money and other things we could be spending the money on, then I would say I think the majority of people would not support that.
Sole authority was taken away from Nixon when he was on his way out.
Yes, and that was illegal, actually. So yeah, when Nixon was drinking heavily and becoming more erratic, I can't remember, but yes, the people kind of next in command said, if you get an order from Nixon to launch nuclear weapons, don't do it and come talk to me first. But that was actually illegal.
There was an item on the news today, I'm not sure whether it was NPR or whether it was KNKX, but it was on there, All Things Considered, this afternoon, about they're pouring grout into tunnel number 2 at Hanford because it's considered unstable. These tunnels, I don't know how many there are are obviously at least 2. They've got trains in there that are full of nuclear waste, and the idea is to just let that sit there and deteriorate over time. But the tunnels, one of them collapsed a while ago, and so what they're doing now is they're pouring grout at least into tunnel number 2, maybe also into the one that sort of semi-collapsed. But that brings it up to the forefront of people's thoughts again about the dangers of having this stuff just sitting around. But it also reminds us that things do deteriorate. And so then what?
Right. Right, I think again, if we could put even a portion of the budget going into creating new nuclear weapons, into making sites like this safe for workers and residents in the area, and, you know, containing that waste and that radiation, we would absolutely support that, and we need to make sure that these sites are safe for people.
Mitigating research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we all remember hearing about Chernobyl, which sounds comfortably far away, but effects from Chernobyl were felt outside of Russia in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So we in the healthcare reform industry, we have a villain. And it really resonates with the public. That is the insurance industry.
Yeah.
That's the major villain. There's other villains too. So who is the villain for the nuclear weapons and other weapons industry? I would think it'd be the weapons manufacturers.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm just wondering, is there a possibility of getting the public resonating with that idea that these weapons manufacturers, they really don't create that many jobs. They're really a drain on the economy because all the money that's going into them is going nowhere just to produce weapons, and if you don't use them, it's just money wasted. Have you tried to villainize the weapons industry in that way, economically, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk all the time about how there are a lot of people who stand to make a lot of money from our continued reliance and production of nuclear weapons, and that is a huge driver of why we continue to have these kinds of policies and this kind of spending. And nuclear weapons contractors spend a massive amount of money lobbying Congress to create these new kinds of weapons and to land the deals to make, you know, new ICBMs or new bombers. And in Washington, we talk a lot about Boeing because, you know, Boeing is a company that I think most people in Washington are very familiar with, and they know people who work at Boeing, and is really a source of pride in our state. But Boeing is one of the largest nuclear weapons producers in the United States. And they're set to be the ones to make our new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And just landed, I think, a $350 million contract from the government to remake those. So it's just the very beginning of that process. So, you know, and people are surprised to learn that because they don't think of Boeing as a nuclear weapons maker. They think of them as the people who make airplanes.
Yeah, it surprises me. I just don't.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is, we absolutely do talk about that. And that is, yeah, I think, you know, that's another way to connect this kind of spending to people's day-to-day lives.
And how do people respond when they hear about that?
Well, I think people are shocked often to find out about companies like Boeing, especially here in Washington. And I mean, I think in the way that people are very angry and, you know, feel very rightly that it is unjust that corporations control so much of our policy and have such a say in our policy, that is the same reaction we get when we talk about this with nuclear weapons.
Are there any other brand name companies that do this?
Oh, Honeywell is one that makes a lot of like home goods. That also is a big producer of nuclear weapons. The other ones like Northrop Grumman or Raytheon are known as, you know, arms, or Lockheed Martin, you know, are known as arms producers more generally. But
Someone told me that GE got out of it. Is that true?
that's correct. Yeah, General Electric used to, and doesn't anymore. Yeah, and I think there were a lot of efforts in the 70s and 80s around boycotting, and, you know, pointing the finger at them.
So as physicians, we're all great communicators, but this issue of nuclear weapons is very difficult to talk about because the more information you get out, the research has shown that people get emotionally flooded because these are, you know, it's like climate change, it's doomsday. And it's very hard to grasp onto it without like having your defense mechanisms get flooded, emotional flooding, and then you turn off. You gotta put it away to go on with your life, sort of thing. So it's a difficult issue to talk about and keep in people's faces.
But you know, have you thought, you mentioned before about, well, when there's lots of stuff in the news about North Korea and Iran and all of that business, and that brings it home a little bit closer. Have you, any of your coalition, thought to use that when those incidents occur, to then come out and say, by the way?
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that we try to do is build more local media attention and frame the media conversation when something like that happens, to say, you should remember that we have these nuclear weapons here at home, and we're spending this much money on them, and we have these really dangerous policies. So we've done that when there are, specific media opportunities, and work to do things like submit op-eds and letters to the editor, and to raise awareness around that specifically. I think also a really, yes, this was an article in the Seattle Times Magazine that came out that we worked on with a couple members of our coalition, are highlighted there.
When did that come out?
September, I think.
August 26th.
August.
Was that your instigation?
Pacific Northwest Magazine.
You got that written?
It was actually the person who wrote it used to be involved with that group Ground Zero that's now come up a number of times. So he reached out to them and then got to us through that Ron Judd, yeah. So he was involved in, peace activism back in the 80s, and so knew about that group. And a current event that I think really brought this issue home for a lot of people was the false alarm that happened in Hawaii.
Yes.
I think for a lot of people that made the issue seem really real. But I think we have to also think about something we're working to do as a coalition is how do we better capitalize on those moments, and then what are the stories that really make people connect to this issue, and how to, especially for younger audiences or people who just, generally don't think about this day to day, trying to figure out, what are the best messages. And I think things that, that was something we discovered was really powerful for people.
Well, the thing that scares me is some crazy group getting a hold of a small amount of plutonium or uranium and setting off a dirty bomb in some train station in all of Paris or New York City blowing up.
Yeah.
It might come to, that might be necessary for the rest of the world to wake up to the dangers of it.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly hope that that is not necessary, but I mean, it's the same thing with climate change. Do we have to wait until the storms get worse and worse, or do we have to wait till we have hotter and hotter days, or, until all our, ice caps are completely gone? And it's the same thing with nuclear weapons, but we know that there is an active black market for nuclear material, and every single year there are many incidences of people buying and selling nuclear material on the black market. So that is a very real concern.
Sounds like the basis of updating Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah, Dr. Strangelove is scarily true to reality. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the flow of information, like we support Washington, the University of Washington.
Yeah.
We have a physics department there. We have a lot of people that work and do a lot of research there. I'm sure Washington State University does as well, and some of the other universities around these issues. So we've got dollars that start someplace that seem very innocuous and very intellectual and non-threatening, and yet the results of their work are creating hazards for us and are costing us a lot of money when they could be doing research in other areas. So I'm just wondering, do we have an opportunity to influence those dollars, break the chain, or divert the chain to, do you understand what I'm saying?
Like, can we ensure that research at institutions like UW is going towards...
The UW depends probably more than 60% of their income is from research funds.
Right.
I'm sure.
Yeah. And I don't know the specifics on, what kind of research is happening at Washington universities around nuclear weapons. I know that University of Washington, through the Jackson School, has some specific programs around nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction more generally, and that there is actually there's a department that is a bit of a pipeline for people to go into the nuclear weapons industry, not against the nuclear weapons industry. And so, that's something that we're aware of. We haven't really worked as of yet to try to dismantle that in any way. But it would be a very interesting thing to look into. I went to Berkeley, which is part of the Lawrence Livermore whole, family, and where, which is very involved in nuclear weapons production. So, it's something that I think about, certainly personally, a lot as well.
Anyway, just a vote.
Yeah, it would be a big thing to tackle, but it would be very worthy. Yeah.
It seems to me in the 60s, we used to put pressure on research institutions.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and
Boston.
I don't think that, I think especially nuclear weapons research is kept very under the radar. It's not something that universities brag about, almost never. And like, for example, going to Berkeley, I did not realize that we were part of, I knew we had Lawrence Livermore labs, but I didn't know that they had a role in nuclear weapons research and production. So a lot of it is, maybe it's just part of it is creating that awareness in the first place.
Well,
Sorry that I couldn't answer every single question 100%, but.
Oh, you did fine. That's not every question has an easy answer,
Yes.
let alone an answer at all.
That is very, especially on this issue, these are very complex issues.
Trump is a disaster from my standpoint.
Yeah.
He's doing everything he can to promote nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
I
Absolutely moving us in the entirely wrong direction.
The only advantage for me is that I'm older and I'm gonna die before you, but you're gonna be have this problem for many years.
I know that it's our
well,
grandchildren.
keep your fingers crossed that we pass before this happens.
Yeah, right.
Because, it's bearing down on us.
I wonder how you, it might be too late to ask a question, but how you personally, from your generation who isn't particularly interested in nuclear power, got into this.
Should I still talk into the mic? Are people still?
There are two people on.
Okay, yeah. Like a lot of young people who work on this issue, there aren't that many of us, but a lot of us stumbled into this issue in one way or another, whether it was through a college course or someone they met or, something like that when I've talked to colleagues. And that was absolutely true for me. I didn't know a single thing about nuclear weapons 2 years ago before I started this job. And it was a family connection. My mom knows someone at WPSR and introduced me, and they were looking for an intern, and so I started at WPSR as an intern, and then eventually it became a full-time job. But it was never my intention to work on nuclear issues in college. If you told me that was what I was going to work on, and now, I hope to spend, at least the next few years, if not longer, working on this issue. I love working on nuclear weapons and may end up dedicating my whole life to this issue, but
well, you dedicated your whole life to be an organizer for
yes.
Progressive things.
Exactly, and
you didn't come here, as a learning experience.
Right, but
a whole lot with you.
I imagined I trained as an environmental organizer, so I imagined I would work on climate change, and ended up working on a different existential threat.
So we'll get our board to poll them, and
okay,
probably within a week we can let you. Thank you so much. You've given your whole evening to us in this holiday season.
Thank you for your very excellent questions. This is perhaps the most engaged audience I've ever worked with.